I've just finished reading one one week in April here, the Radical Rising of 1820. Before we talk about the book, can I just quickly ask you? You're a Clydeside girl, aren't you?
Huh.
Yeah. Do you think that your kind of red Clydeside past led you to these radicals as well?
I think they did. I'm a girl who's very influenced by her dad and her mum, but my dad was very left wing, and he was in the Labour Party when it was very left wing, and he was a councillor in Inverness and worked as an election agent. So it was his influence, and he told me a lot about the Red Clydesiders, but even he didn't tell me about 1820. I think, presumably because he didn't know, because it's been such a hidden history. Yeah, I see it as kind of following on from when the Clyde ran red, in which I mentioned 1820 briefly in one chapter.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's the very point that I was going to come on to. Like you, I've got a sort of like socialist past in education, but the radical rising of 1820 is something that I kind of knew about, but didn't realise quite how profound it was. So do you think we're just not teaching it at all?
I don't know, because there's been a bit of discussion online, and some people said they were taught it at Cumbernauld High School, in the 1970s or something. I wasn't taught it at school. I was taught about Thomas Muir, the
Yeah.
father of Scottish democracy, who's another man who deserves to be much better known. But I think I was taught that because our history teacher, Mr. Donald Asher, who was about 7 feet tall, and you just wanted to get him off the curriculum and telling you stories, and he did. And I think he thought we should know about Thomas Muir, and he told us about that, but he didn't tell us about 1820 either. So I think it's been so sort of totally hidden.
It's a curious thing that this radical history's been whitewashed out. I mean, one of the things that struck me in the book was the brutality by which the state reacted to even the slightest inkling of the peasants thinking for themselves.
Yes.
And we're still living with that, aren't we? Because they basically snuffed out the rising and then snuffed them out.
Yes. And I think the authorities, the powers that be, were terrified of the radicals, and that's why they came down so hard. And it was, as you'll know, it was there was all this unrest after the Napoleonic Wars, and there were risings or planned risings in all sorts of places. And later in 1831, there was a rising in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. Was probably the first place where the red flag was flown, which is interesting. I think the brutality was horrific, and this hanging a man's bad enough, but hanging a man and then beheading him, it's an extra level of viciousness. And I was trying to think when anybody had been hanged in Scotland before that date, beheaded rather. And I thought, well, Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded, but that was in England. And I did sort of think about researching on the internet about hangings and beheadings, but it took me to places on the internet I didn't want to go. So I didn't go much further than that.
Let's just veer away from that then, Maggie, shall we? let's stay away from Nightmare Country. So let's just briefly recap, very, very briefly, the radical rising of 1820. What exactly, very, very briefly, happened?
There had been this unrest after the Napoleonic Wars, and there was a slump after the war, and a lot of demobbed soldiers coming home, and they were looking for work, so there wasn't much work to go around. And working conditions were terrible. They were really harsh. And very few people had the vote. Only a small number of the gentry had the vote. So the Scottish radicals were demanding universal suffrage and a reform of the Westminster Parliament, which astonishingly was deeply corrupt. And I know, it takes you aback. So that's what they wanted: universal suffrage, reform of the Westminster Parliament, annual parliaments, so that people had to be re-elected every year. I don't think we would like that now, but I can see where they were coming from and wanting that. And they thought that if they had that, then there would be an improvement in living and working conditions as well.
It's almost touching the belief that they could reform it, don't you think?
Yes, it is touching. And I sometimes wonder what they would think nowadays. I know people can get more interested in politics, but still an awful lot of people who are not interested in politics. And I think politics is life and death. And it really was life and death in those days.
Yeah, it certainly was life and death. Let me just take you to the beginning of the rising, because, of course, Benjamin Disraeli said, notably, keep your eyes on Paisley,
Uh-huh.
because Paisley seems to be a real hotbed of this radical thought. And the weavers, what fascinated me was the number of times that the weavers came into the story, or so and so was a weaver and this was a weaver. Why were the weavers such shock troops of radical thought?
The weavers were the aristocrats of labour. And one of the reasons was, before weaving and textiles went into factories, the weavers wove their cloth at home. I don't know if you've ever been to the weaver's cottage at Kilbarchan or the small shop cottages in Paisley. So the weaver would have his workshop, and his family would live in the other rooms in the house. And because they, to an extent, they worked for themselves, so they could carve out leisure time for themselves. And they were very well-educated men, and they would often have a book resting on their loom. So if they didn't have work for a couple of hours, they would read. So many of them wrote as well. So many of them were poets. And it was said that every third weaver in Paisley was a poet. And I thought, why is this? So I asked somebody at the weaver's cottage at Kilbarchan, and she said there's a theory that, you know, because they use their feet on their looms as well, they were attuned to the rhythm of making cloth. They were attuned to the rhythm of words. And that, I find that convincing.
I find that so lovely, the idea. Also, speaking as a comedian, you also uncover the origin of the word heckler.
Yes. Yes, because heckles were combs which were used to tease out the sheep's wool to make it finer for spinning. So that shows that because we say somebody's heckled, it comes from the weavers. And the weavers were like this very much over central Scotland and down into Ayrshire, and weavers in other places like Yorkshire as well were very preeminent in the radical movement. And because they had educated themselves and educated their children, I think they felt it was even more wrong that they didn't have any say in government.
Yeah, they struck me almost like the miners of the mid 20th century.
Yes.
Kind of like that elite.
Very much so. And there were colliers involved in the radical rising as well, but it was preeminently a weaver's strike, yes.
I think people today reading, and your book, oh, by the way, how rude of me, I should say, fabulous book, real page turner. And you think, where is this HBO miniseries? Because it would be phenomenal. Because the book is full of incredible characters. I mean, larger than life doesn't do them justice. Have you got any favourites? Oh, must be, that's a difficult question, sorry.
That's a difficult question, but I'm kind of in love with James Wilson of Straven.
Me too.
He was one of the men who was hanged just before his 60th birthday, just to add insult to injury, because he comes across as quite cheerfully sarcastic, and I like people like that. And he wrote poetry, and he bred pointer dogs, and he tinkered with clocks and other mechanical things, and he was a giant of a man, I think. But I'm pretty fond of John Baird and Andrew Hardy as well. And Andrew Hardy's letters survived, and he was so fond of his family. So he smuggled out letters to his mother, his widowed mother, and his siblings, and to his girlfriend. And I find that very, very touching.
You see, when you say letters, this is the other thing that I think might startle people now looking back, and it shouldn't, but it might, the degree of literacy that these men and women have. They are writing constantly. They are writing letters, they're writing newspapers, they're writing leaflets. I think the other thing that would startle us in the 21st century is the fact that they managed to get huge crowds of people together. At one point, there's a meeting in Glasgow, which is in the tens of thousands, without access to the internet.
Yes.
Somehow they managed to do this. It's incredible.
I think that meeting in Mr. Turner's Fields, which is now the Garngad, now that I know where it is, I've pinpointed where it is. So when you drive into Glasgow and I look up and there's 5 high flats there, and I think thousands of people gathered up there. That's fascinating. They had got some publicity because they wanted to hold the meeting in the Trades Hall in Glasford Street in Glasgow, but Glasgow city fathers who were very against the radicals refused it. So then they went to an inn which had a big courtyard, and the landlord of the inn said yes, and then was told this would not be good for him if he allowed this meeting to go ahead. So there was lots of free publicity going round, and people had time to be able to work out where the meeting was. But it's incredible. And if you think, you know, you think of Glasgow Cathedral and Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and as you say, tens of thousands of people walking up there. And everybody, I mean, most people had to walk there. Not
Yeah.
many poor people had horses. So that is amazing.
Yeah, the sheer logistics of getting all those people there and also then dispersing them. And the point that's made several times in your book before the Rising is that these huge meetings are good-natured.
Yes. They sort of remind me a bit of the Tartan Army. You know, don't show your country up, don't let your country down. So don't betray your class, as it were. Be well behaved, don't get drunk. I disagree with him on don't drink tea, because it was to deprive the government of the tax. But they were really well behaved, and they could so easily be dismissed as a mob that they went out of their way to be well behaved.
And it certainly seems to freak the establishment out no end.
It absolutely did, yes. And I think it was the cheek of the lower orders saying, we want to have a say over our lives. And the funny thing is, I think it's the biopic about William Wilberforce, and there's something about, I think that's the Great Reform Act, and there's somebody in Parliament, and somebody says democracy, and he goes, democracy? Because democracy was a dirty word. You know, who were the people to be allowed to have a say?
It's important to remember that democracy is quite a fragile thing, quite a modern thing, and we really should be defending it at every possible turn.
We're accepting restrictions at the moment because we have to, but I think we have to keep a watching brief on this and let this become normal.
Yeah, exactly. But let's go back to 1820, and let's go back to the radical right and the Rising. Another aspect of the book that fascinates me was the internationality of the works that these men were absorbing and passing around. Scotland was very outward looking, it seems to me.
Yes, and I think Scotland, to an extent, has always as much looked across the Atlantic as to anywhere else. And there's a piece of music that the Radicals played at their meeting, and it's the Dead March from Saul, which is an oratorio by Handel. And the reason that they might have played that was because it had been played at George Washington's funeral in America. And they really admired the American revolutionaries who'd said, no taxation without representation, we do not want a king. So there was a lot of influence coming from there. Also from revolutionary France as well, of course.
Yeah, there's a sheer ferment, but it's the ability that these men have exchanging works and exchanging ideas that are global. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. And no wonder the establishment was slightly freaked out. I mean, it seems that the establishment was a bit nervous about the whole idea of education. It's almost like they want to shut that down.
Yes, yes. And, you know, if you educate people, then they start to think for themselves. And for some people in authority, that makes them very uncomfortable. I think that was the case then.
deeply uncomfortable. So we have this massive movement, and it seems to be building, because I couldn't help but notice in your book, as you're writing about the great gatherings, they're getting bigger, they're demanding more. Then we have Peterloo, of course, which is a bit of a game changer, as far as I can see. Like, real violence is offered.
Yes, Peterloo did not happen in isolation. Peterloo was part of all this movement and all this unrest. And it was that peaceful protesters who gathered in Manchester, dressed in their Sunday best, not violent, were attacked by hussars wielding sabres and shot at. And there was so much in Scotland of people saying, remember Manchester. And there was a big meeting in Paisley in reaction to Peterloo. So there was a great fellow feeling. And it was, how can a state run down its own citizens? It's just not right.
Oh, I do feel that was one of the crucial moments. How can a state do that? And of course, then the militias get moved into, the military gets moved to Glasgow, closer to the trouble, if you like. Everybody's getting looked, and at that point, the pressure seems to be almost inexorable that there's something will happen. Did you get that feeling that?
Yes, I think Glasgow was a powder keg, and they seriously thought, the authorities seriously thought that the radicals were going to mount an attack on Glasgow. One of them poo-pooed it, saying, you know, we really just weren't that organised. But the authorities were terrified. I think they knew that they were grinding people down and that eventually people were going to explode. It was like a pan of milk boiling over.
there's just no way of holding it back when it gets started. But
No.
I also got the impression reading your book, and you've got a really great way of kind of tapping into how they probably thought. I felt, and I got the impression that the radicals felt that they had no other option. They had tried petitions, they had tried meetings. Now they had to do something else.
They were very, very frustrated because the only legal way to bring about change was to send a petition to the Prince Regent, who became George IV in January 1820. It's probable that he never read any of them. And these petitions were going from all over Britain, and they had to be very humble to the most noble prince and all this guff. But nobody was paying any attention to it. And you think how stupid they were not to see that people were going to get so frustrated that they were going to do something. Some people didn't want violence at all. And some of what happened in the Radical Rising wasn't violence, it was a strike. It was a withdrawal of labour. But that in itself was really illegal. And there was no unions. If anyone tried to form a union, it was called an illegal combination. And people could be tried for forming a trade union.
And they came down hard, as we know, on that. Yes. Transportation was another favourite tool of the establishment, wasn't it? Yeah.
Which I think is so cruel. It's like a living death, because in those days you couldn't have anticipated that you would ever see your country again or see your family again. Although it's quite satisfying that a lot of the radicals who went to Australia achieved a measure of freedom after they'd been there for a couple of years and prospered. Quite a few of them prospered, and you think doing well is the best revenge. Okay.
And they also don't seem to have stopped making trouble even when they got to whatever they got to the penal colonies. They do seem to have been harassing again, which I think is great. I agree with you.
Well, they wanted what they wanted, and they wanted to stand up for people. And a lot of it is about. It's not just about you, it's about your neighbour and your friends and other people too. They had a real feeling that we have to make things better for everybody.
Steady on there, Maggie. I mean, you're close to talking socialism here. I mean, good grief.
Our friend.
There'll be a dragoon coming through that door in a minute.
Oh God, I know. No regimentals.
Well, I mean, if there's a hussar and a nice wee tight pair of trousers, well... Incidentally, can I just say thank you very much for your references to Glasgow banter. That was brilliant. And I could imagine guys on horseback and lassies coming up with the banners going, "Oh, hey there, sonny."
Yeah, that is where I differ from academic historians who would not offer that point of view. But you think it's Glasgow, they're chatting to each other.
Two fine-looking Amazons. You're not telling me that they're not glad I and somebody in a nice jacket sitting on a charger. Yeah. Just let's go back to the writing. I would urge everyone to read it, because I would urge everyone to rediscover who these people were and what they tried to do, and how brutally the state reacted. So let's just look at its legacy. Does it have one?
I think so. I think it's got the legacy that reform, because they'd worked so hard to be respectable and not be a mob, and to put what they wanted in simple but eloquent terms, I think it allowed for the possibility that reform had to happen. And there were middle-class reformers who were totally against any violence, but who were saying we're holding the country back by not allowing people to have better lives. And then in 1832 came the Great Reform Act, which was only a measure of more people being allowed to vote, but it was a milestone on the road to finally to universal suffrage, which of course we didn't really get until 1928, when all women over 21 got the vote as well. So yes. It was a long way.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is worth putting that in a time perspective, that these men and women who fought for this in 1820 never saw it. They didn't see what it was that they never got there, but they started.
Yes, they started, and they took an enormous risk. Some of them risked their lives, some of them risked their freedom. A lot of the people in Paisley had to flee the country, and some of them managed to make it back, but some didn't. And then there was, the massacre in Greenock, when the militia fired into a crowd that was trying to free radical prisoners. So people, again, I keep coming back to, they weren't saying pull the ladder up, Jack, I'm all right. They wanted everyone to have a better life.
How could we take it into schools?
Well, you see, I love people who reenact, and there's loads of people reenact Jacobite times and other times. I'm not aware of anybody reenacting 1820, but I think it could be done. I think that could be interesting.
Just checking out one of these frocks here, because I'd like to think I look like Eliza Fletcher. Oh, she's a bonny looking lassie.
I had to put her in because she is so bonny, and
So bonny.
The lovely. I mean, she's slightly earlier than the Radical Rising, but I thought, you know, Granny Duncan and Janet Hamilton are estimable women, but they're not beautiful like.
Yeah, I have to give it. So this is Eliza Fletcher, right? She's absolutely gorgeous. Yeah. But actually, I think I look more like that, really, which is.
She intrigues me, Janet Hamilton, because she seems
Janet
to have
Hamilton.
Veronica Lake bit of hair over her eye. So I'm wondering if there's something wrong with her eye.
And of course that takes us, anyway, because you mentioned something wrong with the eye, beautiful illustrations as well, by the way, thank you very much. Thomas Muir of Hunter's Hill. Now, he's probably the only one I've ever heard being sung about, but I could be wrong. But I've heard him being sung about. But maybe that's it. Maybe we need to start reenacting. Maybe we need to go
reenacting song. There's a lovely song called Dark Bonnie Muir, and there's a singer called Alan Dixon who sings it. And there's another song by Martin Caulfield, Looking for Pearlie Wilson. And he belongs to the Lanarkshire Songwriters, and I thought that's fab. People are still being creative and getting together and being inspired by the past.
Brilliant. So I'm going to dress as Eliza Fletcher. I think you're Janet Hamilton. Is that okay?
Well, I don't know about that. I think I probably do look more like Janet Hamilton. Although I haven't. I mean, Janet and I are both writers, but I haven't had 10 children.
Okay, then I'll be Janet Hamilton. You can be Eliza.
Maybe a few decades ago.
And I'll see you on front. It is. However, I was just thinking. It's very curious. We're talking about legacy there. There is one legacy because you mentioned it, and I heard it echoing in my head just as you said it, and it's an interesting echo. They were quite anti-alcohol.
Yes.
Quite a lot of radicals. And suddenly in my head, I suddenly heard Jimmy Reed.
Yes.
At the UCS working.
The women.
Yeah. Bevy. No vandalism. Nay bevy. And I've just realised like an echo.
Because the world is watching us.
Because the world.
I included that in When the Clyde Ran Red because I think he was sort of the end of the Red Clydesiders, really. The end of the towering figures.
Yeah. We need some more towering figures back. Don't we?
Yeah.
Let's go and get a banner made. Maggie, it's a fantastic book. It really is. It is 1 week in April. Go and get it. Read it. Read it to your children. Because we need to rediscover this radical past. These were people who were unafraid, despite the fact the price that they paid was absolutely terrible. The other important fact, and I'm really so glad that you brought this out, Maggie, was that the state is vicious and vindictive when it wants to keep its own possessions and power.
Privileged people do not give up their privilege easily. They cling on to it. And they still do.
And they still do. Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you.